Okay, I think we're officially ready to go. Uh, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world today. We are thrilled and honored to have with us David Dillon Thomas. He is the content strategy advocate for the Think Company. And more importantly today for our topic, he's also the author of Design for Cognitive Bias. He actually wrote the book. So that's what we're going to talk about today, about designing for with cognitive bias in mind. So we're really honored to have you with us, David. Dave, I'm going to call you Dave by preference, with us today. Welcome to Pandemic Pundit Series, Marketing in a Pandemic Series.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. And I just have to warn the audience that I'm on some serious pain medication because I dislocated my shoulder. So if I'm not as clear as I normally am, that's probably the reason. So David, so just for the benefit of the audience, and I think people maybe sort of the term cognitive bias may be something that people sort of can guess at, or it's probably self-explanatory to some extent. But I think you have a particular definition of it, and maybe we can start the conversation by sort of defining, for the benefit of our audience, what do you mean by cognitive bias, and why is it critical for everything that we do?
Sure. So cognitive bias is really just a fancy word for a shortcut gone wrong. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about how fast to talk, where to look, what to do with my hands. And if I thought very carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that our minds are we live our lives mostly on autopilot. Sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong, though, and we call those shortcuts gone wrong cognitive biases.
Okay. So this is inherently a survival instinct or skill. Right. So having cognitive bias has allowed us to sort of evolve to who we are today. If we didn't have cognitive bias, we'd probably be get eaten up by something. Is that a gross simplification?
Well, it's really that if we didn't have the shortcut, we would get eaten by something. But if the shortcut goes wrong, right, sometimes it's harmless. Like there's this great bias called illusion of control. And the way it shows up is if you're playing a game where you have to roll a die and you need a high number, you'll roll the die really hard. But if you need a low number, you'll roll it really soft. And that doesn't make any sense. Like it's an error in judgment, but it's a shortcut, right? We like to think we have control and we don't. And so we embody that by how we roll the die. So it's really more that the shortcuts themselves are just helping us get through the day. But sometimes the shortcuts are like, oops.
Okay. So what would be some sort of, so the particular biases that the shortcuts you're talking about that you want to sort of address today, and that we want people to pay attention to, is specifically what are these cognitive biases that you feel get in the way, is a shortcut gone wrong, right? So what would give us some examples so the viewers understand what you're particularly focusing on, maybe.
Sure. So the one that I like that really got me started is this notion of how pattern recognition can sort of lead to unfair hiring practices, for example. So what I mean by that is, let's say, someone is hiring a web developer, right, in the States, and their experience leads them to think, like, if I just say the word web developer to like someone in a Silicon Valley, the image that might pop into their head without them even thinking about it might be skinny white guy, right? And when they see a resume, right, where the name at the top of the resume doesn't fit that, they start to give it the side eye. And it's not because they actually believe that men are better developers than women, or white people are better developing than people of color. But the pattern that's been built up their whole lives through television, movies, and offices they've worked in is, skinny white dude equals web developer equals skinny white dude. Like that's just the math that their head is doing, and that's the shortcut their mind is taking. And that ends up hurting somebody who otherwise might have a good chance of getting a job as a web developer. So those are the kinds of biases that I feel like are harmful. That's when we need to be concerned that the shortcuts are actually eventually hurting people.
And I think you got also a tremendously sort of interesting example in your book about the hiring bot Amazon had, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Can you bring our viewers up to speed on that one?
Sure. So a few years ago, Amazon created an algorithm, right, that was going to help them speed up the hiring process. It was going to look at resumes before they came in and sort of give people an idea which ones to pay attention to. They noticed, though, that the algorithm was really just recommending men Like it was a very sexist algorithm, so much so that if a resume had the name of a women's college on it, it would demote the resume. And when they tried to figure out why the bot was so sexist, they said, okay, well, what did we train the algorithm on, right? What data did we give it to start with? And they gave it like the last 10 years of resumes to Amazon. And what a lot of those had in common is they were coming from men. And so the AI takes one look at that and says, gee, you sure must like dudes, and then just keeps recommending dudes.
Wow. So this, I mean, this particular example sort of brings to mind, I think, one of the sort of emerging tech trends, I don't know whether you call it a trend anymore, it's actually a reality, is that, we are letting loose a whole bunch of AI, artificial intelligence agents, right, across lots of different platforms, right? So, and the basis of sort of the accuracy that we assign to those has to do with the fact that, they look at lots of data, so they learn or teach themselves. And so if as you were saying, like Amazon did, if you actually let them loose on lots of historical data, it could be that if the historical data has to be, is biased, for example, it is biased against women because women are, just getting into tech and they're breaking into STEM. And so they're obviously going to be underrepresented, especially if you take that example. Similarly, I think African Americans in certain jobs, I mean, the world's full of biases in some sense. So all of those sort of historical data, I mean, the AI is going to learn. So essentially, this so-called smart thing is actually going to be quite dumb when it comes to things that actually matter from a social impact standpoint. So is this something to be careful about?
Oh, extremely. And I think it's more about our misinterpretation of what AI is. Meredith Broussard has written a fantastic book called Artificial Unintelligence, and it does a great job of demystifying AI. Because basically AI is a prediction machine. You feed it a lot of data about what's happened in the past, and then you ask it based on that data to make predictions about the future. She gives a great example of an exercise you might do in Algorithm 101, where you take data of all the people who died on the Titanic. And you take a data of all the passengers, right? And you're going to create an algorithm that's going to predict, based on the passenger list, who's going to die. And it's looking at factors like, okay, how many people who died were sitting in steerage versus had a first class ticket, right? How many were men versus women, blah, 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 blah. And you give it like half the data. So it says, okay, these people had these status and these people died and these people didn't. Now I'm going to give you some fresh data that I didn't give you yet. And you tell me, you predict which ones died and which ones didn't. Right. And depending on how good a job it does, you say, oh, good AI. Right. But that's it. Right. If you give it faulty data, or if there's data you can't give it that's actually crucial to making the decision, then it's going to make faulty predictions. And if you point, our myth about AI is that it's actually this all-knowing, like Spock-like figure, this purely logical Vulcan, this, that is going to look at the world and then make this unbiased judgment on the world. When in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. It's going to make predictions based on what you show it. So if you show it a racist, sexist world, it's going to make racist, sexist predictions.
And it's going to do that at speed and at scale.
Oh,
so
and
it's doing it much quicker.
But what's really dangerous about it is that the value we give it. So I'll give you another example. The Compass algorithm. This was a company that was trying to create software to create more impartial judging decisions, right? Okay. So you might have somebody up for parole, or you might have somebody, you're deciding what sentencing recommendation to give them. And theoretically, the unbiased algorithm is supposed to look at that person's record and tell you how likely they are to commit a crime again. The problem was, for the same record, it was saying that Black people were more likely to commit crimes again than white people. And it literally got it wrong. Like there was one guy who was sort of like, it said this person's going to commit a crime again. Black guy, he didn't. And the white guy was like, oh, it's a low risk. And he did, right? So it was just categorically wrong. But the problem was the survey data that they fed it had questions in there that were supposed to predict criminal behavior. And there were questions like, is anyone in your family in jail? Right? Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? Like all these sort of things that were proxies for race, right? So in a way, like it was making even more biased, and to your point, scaling that. And what made this so dangerous isn't just that it was giving bad advice to judges. It was giving advice to judges that could let the judge wash their hands of the decision and say, well, it's not me. This computer said, right? That's the dangerous part, is that we allow this thing to take over our judgment. Right? Because, hey, Who has time to look through all these resumes? Who has time to look through all these criminal records? Let the computer do that, and I'll just make the final decision, right? That's the myth we have. And if we rely that much on AI because we think it's unbiased, that's where the scale comes in. If we have a realistic kind of view of AI, like if that Amazon bot's job was to detect bias, well, good job. You just detected a very big bias that this company has, right? But that's what makes it so dangerous, is how we treat the AI and what we think of it.
Wow. I mean, this is sort of, I mean, it sort of makes your head spin a little bit because, in the tech industry, we now, the management ethos that all the MBAs are sort of fed is, hey, don't rely on an instinct and gut. Obviously that can have its own cognitive bias, but data doesn't lie. I mean, that's, you hear that like all the time, right? Use data, let data drive decisions, right? These are all the buzzwords that one hears in sort of the latest management science that goes around. And I mean, you are now clearly pointing to something that, the data can lie, and it can lie at significant scale simply because, it's not got really a sort of a intelligence of its own. It's predictive, as you say, right? So it's gonna look at stuff that, all our inherent biases and then amplify it 10 times and tell you the same thing, except now with the sort of the value of I'm right because I'm data, right?
Well, the thing that we forget is that data is socially constructed, right? We like to think of data and numbers as being impartial and cold, or even computers and technologies partial, but all of it is made by people, right? Someone decides. Any data set you see, a human being decided what goes in that data set and what doesn't go in that data set. And if you don't know what their biases are, you are not going to know what bias is inherent in the data.
Absolutely. So now this concept of cognitive bias, and I know that your book deals with this a little bit, but quite a lot. But what advice, do you give in terms of, so is this the book and the stuff you're talking about particularly useful for people who design or create content, or is this for everybody who makes a product or service? Or does this concept of cognitive bias sort of pervade across lots of things that we do in our everyday lives? So this is not just about the content. This could be about a handbag you design, or a car, or a medicine that you bring to market. Am I oversimplifying?
It's definitely, it's for everybody. The response I've gotten from people who've read the book is that, oh yeah, I want to show this to my boss, or I want to show this to somebody in HR, I want to show this to and that's intentional. Like, I'm very glad to hear that feedback, because that's intentional. The intro to the book, I sort of define a designer's job as someone who helps other people make decisions. And that goes beyond visual designers or UX designers or content people. Like, I think that almost everybody's job in some way or another is to help other people make decisions. And the idea is that if you don't really understand how people make decisions, you're not going to be very good at your job. So I feel like that's why, and the examples in the book aren't like code, right? Like, they're fairly relatable examples, no matter what industry you're in. So it's really more, it's called Design for Cognitive Bias, but it's really just, hey, here's how you help people make decisions, no matter what your job is. And by the way, now that you know this, you're kind of responsible for helping people make better decisions.
Karthik, I'm sure you have tons of questions. I know you're waiting in the wings. I want to get in, so please.
That's all right. Hi, David. I was just reading this recent, interestingly, a World Economic Forum. They put out this article, like literally a few weeks ago, right, on the 3 cognitive biases that are perpetuating racism at work, right? And bear with me on this one. The first one they said was moral licensing. And and funnily enough, in a 2010 study, they said, participants who had voiced support for U.S. presidential candidate Barack Obama just before 2008 election were less likely, when presented with a hypothetical slate of candidates for a police force job, to select a black candidate for the role. And the hypothesis was that presumably it was because the act of expressing support for a black president candidate made them feel that they no longer needed to prove their lack of prejudice.
Can you
decipher that for us, please?
Oh my God. So moral licensing, Malcolm Gladwell, I think the very first episode of his podcast, he actually talks about this. So that was my introduction to it. It's fascinating. So basically the idea with moral licensing is if society deems some value, right, like recycling, and there's an actual experiment on this, like recycling is good. It's good to be green, right? I am now going to feel some obligation to look good in the eyes of society, right? So if that's my motivation for being green, not I actually care about the environment, but I care about how people view me, I am going to do the least amount possible to make myself, to check that box, right? So there's an actual experiment where you have people, I think they like fill out a form or something that sort of says like that they're, going to be green or that they are green or some sort of just little demonstration of their greenness. And then you have in that room a recycling bin and a trash bin. And then you have them like throw away, they give them like a bottle or something like of water, incidentally. It's like when they're finished with it, the people who sort of check off the I'm going to be green box or whatever, literally chuck that thing in the trash, are more likely to chuck that thing in the trash than the folks who don't make that commitment, right? So, or as likely, right? So it's like one of those like, I'm not doing this because I actually care about the environment. I do it because I care about how people view me and how I view myself. Another friend of mine, Erica D. Franz, like boils this down so simply. And she's like, if you want to predict human behavior, ask yourself, what is going to make that person feel good about themselves, right? So if voting for Barack Obama made them feel good about themselves, right? Not because they truly loved black people or they truly wanted equality in the world, but they just wanted people to get off their back. Then any subsequent decision, it's like, well, I've already proved that I'm for black people. I voted for like, here's my license, right? Literally more license. Here's my I love black people license. See, I voted for Barack. Now I get to say the N-word. That was another thing that happened after Obama came into office. People just suddenly started being like, oh, I can use the N-word all the time. And that's like, no, you can't. But yeah, we saw this with, you see a lot of countries that vote in female prime ministers for the first time, right? Turn right around, right? This happened in Australia, turn right around and all of a sudden. And honestly, the proof in the pudding is don't just look at the role of that minority in public facing situations, right? Look at the role of that minority in private. So in Australia, when they had their first female prime minister, most women were still like working at home, were like considered servants in their households. Like that didn't change, even with, and the same thing with, it's not a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement sprung up during the time of Obama, is because even with a black president, white cops were still shooting black people. Right. Like that didn't change at all. It might have actually increased, right? Yeah, so that's the moral license. I'm not shocked that that's what they pointed to.
Yeah. So how does one sort of address cognitive bias then? But because everybody has them, right? It's not like, nobody can take an holier than thou attitude about that and say, well, I don't have any cognitive bias. We all have that because it's part of our sort of evolutionary process in our socialization. So how does one sort of, question one would be, how does one sort of mitigate against that? And two, where is cognitive bias actually useful?
Yeah. So the whole book is really trying to answer that question, right? It's like, now that we know that we have bias, what do we do? And there's usually two overarching strategies. One, you mitigate by, going back to that example of the web developer job, right? You mitigate by removing the opportunity or limiting the opportunity for the bias. So anonymized resumes, right? If the name is throwing you off in your decision making because you've got this little voice in the back of your head, I'm just going to take away the name, right? I'm going to take away the name. I'm going to take away what college they went to. I'm going to take away maybe what jobs they had, like the companies they worked at, because that might be biasing. I'm just going to show you the qualifications. I'm just going to show you the things that are actually going to help you make the decision, right? Because that's my job, is to help you make decisions. So if I'm designing something that's going to help you make a decision, I need to make sure I'm not showing you things that are going to bias it. Or maybe I need to slow you down. A lot of bias comes from thinking too quickly. And we're used to, as designers, thinking of, frictionless experiences, get that thing as fast as possible. It's like, no, actually, sometimes I need to slow you down. So I'm going to introduce design elements or content elements that slow you down. So one way or another, I'm going to use design to mitigate that bias, or kind of to your other point, use it for good, right? So there's a thing called the framing effect, right? Where the way I describe a situation can influence your decision. Now, I can use that to trick you, right? That's what dark patterns are. They're framing something in a way where you're going to check a box you don't really need to check. Or I can use it to actually frame a decision you're about to make in a more pro-social way. So University of Iowa did a thing where prior student evaluations of teachers were very biased against women. They simply added a couple paragraphs to the beginning of the survey the students got saying, hey, look, these things are usually biased against women. Make sure you're making your judgments based on real things and not like appearance or something. And then the people who got those two paragraphs tended to judge less harshly. So that's the sort of mitigating strategy. The other strategy, though, is to kind of introduce other perspectives. So if you are the designer creating the design and you're trying to mitigate your own bias, the best way to do it is to introduce other biases, right? Other people who have different perspectives and can kind of challenge your own.
So would that be you talk about this concept of red and blue teams. Is that what you were?
Yes, that's a classic example, right? So red team, blue team is an exercise where you have a blue team who's going to, let's say you're building an app, and they're going to do the initial research and maybe get as far as wireframes and some ideas for prototyping. But before they go any further, you're going to have a red team. You're going to have a red team come in and for one day. And that red team's job is to go to war with the blue team and just sort of point out every false assumption or more elegant solution they missed or potential causes of harm the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. And again, it's this idea of I'm going to bring in someone else who, not someone who's unbiased, because everybody is biased, but someone who has fresh eyes, who has a different perspective than I do. And together we'll arrive at a less biased outcome.
So, just to sort of explore that idea a little bit more in from a tactical perspective. So somebody, listening to this may be thinking, okay, so the way to eliminate this is, look, I want to make sure that I'm not, biased towards the gender or sexual orientation or race. So I'm going to essentially, create a design team that is quite diverse, like that we have people representative of those sort of criteria, right? Does that solve the problem, or does that introduce a different set of biases?
Well, you got to be careful, right? Because I could, for example, well, we're seeing this right now, right? The Supreme Court, right, in the States right now, we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, rest in power, has passed away. She's a very liberal voice on the court. And one might, standing back from that, say, oh, that was a female justice. Let's make sure to replace her with a female justice, right? That'll, make it an equal bias. When I think everyone knows that Trump's pick for that role is a woman, but is a very different set of standards, right? So it isn't simply a matter of quota filling per se. You have to look at the whole intersectional person and the whole intersectional set of biases that are being introduced. So I think a really good exercise for this is an assumption audit. So it's where a team at the beginning of a project, before they kick it off, they just sit in a room and they lay all the biases out on the table. And it's like, hey, I am a black man, I'm American. I have not been to jail. I am fairly wealthy. English is my first language. And you just lay all these things. I'm, cis. I'm hetero. Just lay all these things out there. I'm 46 years old. Like, you lay all that out there, and everybody kind of just creates that big old pool of intersectionality. And then you start asking questions like, okay, how might these perspectives influence the outcome of this design? And then you ask, well, who's not here, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? No? Okay, that's like 2 million Americans, so okay. Anybody here ever had their immigration status questions? No? Okay, that's not here. And you get that on the table, and then you ask, okay, how is that absence going to influence the outcome? And then you can start having discussions about, okay, well, how do we account for that as we move forward? So you want to be more intersectional when you think about perspective, and you think about like what opinions and biases are here and what biases are not here. Before you kind of jump to conclusions.
That's just a very brilliant observation. Guidance there. Intersectionality. I think that's the real key. I think people think too much in terms of these, the outward appearances, the demographic sort of concepts, right? When in fact, you got to think in terms of mindsets, thinking patterns, assumptions. I think that's the key there. I think that's a really good piece of advice. I've seen this in sort of. When I led design thinking sort of workshops, we sort of had diversity. Oh, yeah, we get somebody from accounting, somebody from marketing, somebody from sales, mix of women, whatever. And funnily, they would always produce the same thing, because what we didn't taking into account, or the companies I was advising was not taking into account, was the fact that while you may have these sort of the persona that you have a diverse team, it's actually not, because in terms of thinking and orientation and outlook, they're all the same. In fact, they're clones, sex and other things aside. Yeah. So I think intersectionality is a good way to crack that nut. Karthik, I know we've got a couple of questions also.
Yeah. We have one question from Ritul Chatwal. Thank you for joining us today. Moral license was point number 1. What are the other 2 points? Okay,
I was curious about that too.
Okay, I will bring that up right now. So the other 2 points were affinity bias and confirmation bias.
How are they defining affinity bias?
They're defining affinity bias as our tendency to get along with others who are like us and to evaluate them more positively than those who are different.
Yeah, there's a great example of this, terrible example of this in hiring practices. So they noticed that when white interviewers were interviewing black applicants, they would sit further away and they would give them less time to answer questions. And then when it was a white applicant, the opposite. And this created this terrible cycle where the black applicant would come in and subconsciously notice all of that and start bombing the interview because they were thinking, oh, I must be bombing the interview. And they start acting like that. And then the white interviewer would look at that and see them behaving differently and be like, oh, this person's bombing the interview, right? And it would create this, and again, start giving signals that they were bombing. And you see that cycle. And then a positive cycle of reinforcement when it was a white interview is like, oh, he's sitting closer. He's giving me more time to answer. This must be going well, right? So all of those, so yeah, I can totally see where affinity bias would be a huge contributor to some trouble.
Yeah, so confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out favor and use information that confirms what you already believe.
Yeah, I don't know how it is elsewhere, but I can tell you right now, I mean, the title of this show is Pandemic Punditry. Like in the States, confirmation bias has taken hold in a big bad way when it comes to coronavirus, the politicization of masks. Affinity bias kind of comes in there too, but like we have the news, the information ecosystem we have here is basically rampant confirmation bias. Like it's confirmation bias at scale. Like you could write a textbook about the information ecosystem around coronavirus in America. Like that's it.
Yeah. True. That's great.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question on the dark patterns that you discussed just a while ago, and it just kind of triggered something in my memory because, I mean, when you read about sociopaths and psychopaths, I don't know this, so it could be like a totally stupid question, right? But are there actually sort of almost dark patterning and using our own cognitive biases against us to believe certain things that they say or want us to do or act in a certain way?
So to clarify, and so I'll start by saying that I use the term dark patterns, but we need a better term.
A stereotype.
Get into the habit of using deceptive patterns as a somewhat more descriptive, less biased term. But to clarify what we're talking about there, so imagine that there is like you're filling out a form, and then there's a part of the form that's like terms of service, check this to say that you're sure, and then below that there's like a CAPTCHA, like prove you're not a robot, and then snug in between there's a little thing that says sign up for our newsletter. And done in such a way where you think that checkbox is mandatory because everything around it is mandatory. Okay, that's a dark pattern. I'm trying to trick you into filling out something you don't really need to fill, right? So when we're talking about sociopaths, so it's interesting. I have a second degree of distance from this. So this is what I've culled from discussions with my wife, and like so I am not an expert. But my understanding is when you're talking about a sociopath, you're talking about a psychopath, you're talking about someone, especially if you're talking about a psychopath, someone who is very good at mimicking human emotion, but does not have the same responses, the same kind of empathy. Like if you're watching a movie and someone like breaks their leg, we're like, oof, right? Psychopaths traditionally doesn't really get fazed by that. That's not, they don't have that same so, and as such, and this veers more to sociopathy, it's not so much about like some kind of bloodlust, like I gotta go out and kill somebody. It's more like, I don't like the way that guy chews gum. I'll just kill him. That way I don't have to listen to him chew his gum anymore. Like that is as reasonable a response to, I don't like the guy chewing that gum as I'm just gonna leave the room. Like perfectly, it's really just which of those is gonna be more convenient for me, right? Not, oh my God, it's wrong to kill, right? So all of that to say, to your point about like, are they manipulating deceptive patterns? The sort of high-level psychopaths and sociopaths like are very good at mimicking human emotion to get you to do what they want. Like manipulation is something they're very like notoriously good at. And you would have serial killers, right? If we're talking about that class of people who generally, like there's a class of serial killer who would kind of have to just break into your home and kill you. There's another kind that could just sort of lure you in and then kill you at their convenience, right? And that luring in, or go about their day as if they didn't have a body in the fridge, right? Jeffrey Dahmer literally had bodies in his fridge, but would just go about his day like everything was fine, because in his head it was. This is not a problem. There's nothing wrong with me having. I get that society doesn't want me to have a body in my fridge, but I can behave as if I agree. Yes, that's terrible, right? So if that's what you're talking about, yeah, there are some psychopaths and sociopaths who are very good at manipulating you into thinking they're just like you. Everything's cool.
But is it at any point okay? I mean, for example, let's say that we've been tasked for designing something for senior citizens, right? And so, obviously we would want to get the biases or the positive biases, I guess. I don't know whether how you do a value judgment there, but you want to design with a bias towards a senior citizen. I mean, maybe the letters are bigger, maybe, the objects themselves are easy to handle because, you assume that, dexterity of your hands are less because of age. So are those cognitive biases or are those just design criteria?
I mean, it's a little bit of both. Right? I think they're definitely design criteria, because I'm put in mind of the Microsoft's sort of accessible Xbox console. Like that was born from, I think it was 6 months at the Cleveland clinics, just like observing people, trying to use the prototype, talking to people. And what they did right there, I think, is something called participatory design. And it's this idea of, if you are going to design something for somebody, right, think about the people who are going to be most impacted by that design, but also have the least power in the say of how that design goes, and then give them as much power as possible. So whether inherently or not, I think Microsoft gave the people who were, I think, in recovery and physical therapy, and dealing with any variety of disabilities, a lot of power, because it wasn't done until they said it was done, right? Or at least that would be the ideal, right? You give the decision-making power to the person who's going to be most impacted by the thing you're building, which honestly, in most cases, is not the person who's going to be impacted who has the most power. It's your boss, it's your CEO, who probably doesn't have any disabilities, right? So we think more about, hey, how can I give that person power? So in like the elder care example, yeah, you would want to give as much decision-making power, because it sounds like they're going to be the ones most impacted by this design, and potentially with the least say in how it goes, right? At the end of the day, are they just going to be handed the thing and say, okay, you got to use this, good luck? Or is it going to be, is this done yet? I don't want to give it to you until this is done, right? I think those are two very different paradigms, but I think the latter is kind of the one that's going to be more equitable.
So I'm hearing sort of two mitigation criteria that we've discussed. One is sort of intersectionality, right? So using intersectionality in its truest sense. The other one is participatory design, which also could make sure that you put positive sort of biases or use get people's input for who, particularly those who you are going to impact most profoundly, into the process. So you sort of design for the and I think that it's because all of this exists in a world with a budget, right? So you do not have infinite time to get every single potential perspective. So I think if you have to prioritize what new perspectives to introduce, you prioritize the people who are going to be most impacted and have the least power. I think power is the dynamic that you really want to think about when you're trying to optimize for how much time, or how are we going to spend time and budget on mitigating bias. Let's spend time and budget on mitigating biases that are going to hurt the most vulnerable. Like that's where we want to prioritize, right? Because when you do that first exercise where it's like, who's not in the room, you're going to get a very long list. So the next step is going to say, well, who on this list is actually going to be impacted the most by this design? And who on this list in that group has the least power? Okay, let's make sure we talk to them. Let's make sure we give them more power. Great.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Dave, how can we use confirmation bias for good, in terms of how do we use it to reinforce what the buyer is thinking and help them along the buyer's journey?
So I think that I have trouble finding a way that confirmation bias is inherently good. Here's what I mean. The scientific method was invented a very long time ago to fight confirmation bias. What I thought the scientific method is the situation where it's like, oh, I have an idea about how the world works, and I'm going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I'm going to write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people are going to try that too. And if they get a good result, we're done. That's it. Right? Yay. Move on to the next thing. The actual scientific method, at least according to actual scientists I've talked to, they corrected me, is more like this. I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test it out. If I get a good response, great. You all try the same thing. Good response, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. Right? I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? And then try and prove that. And that is a much more rigorous approach, but it was invented specifically to fight confirmation bias. So I feel like it's not necessarily a good idea to encourage, at any point, confirmation bias. I think we have to, in order to stay true to ourselves and to the objective reality of the world, or get as close to it as we can, to constantly question it. It's kind of our duty. Now, if we're talking about the buyer's journey, that's one of those places where we have this notion that it is good to rush it, right? I want to get you to think about Amazon's buy now button, right? That is like literally one click. It literally says one click, right? Like it's not even trying to hide the fact that we don't want you to think, right? and I think that could be dangerous. Let me give you an alternative approach to that. So Patagonia is a very environmentally conscious brand. And so they don't want you to ever return anything, because if you return something, that is literally doubling the carbon footprint of that coat, right? So before you hit buy on that coat, they're actually going to put up roadblocks. They're going to have big, long content experiences that really want you to luxuriate in this coat. Make sure you're down with what its message is. Then they're going to have a slowed down buy flow that's going to keep kind of being like, are you sure? All right, let me show you the size options. You still sure? Okay, let me show you this. You still sure? All right, okay, let's do this, right? Rather than, like, you were never going to find a one-click button on Patagonia, right? Now, part of that is their brand, but part of that is their mission. Like, they owe a higher value than just to their shareholders. They owe a value they feel to the environment, and so they're going to conduct business. Yes, they're still a business. They're not a nonprofit. They are going to make money, and they do. Those aren't cheap coats, but they're going to do it in a way that they feel aligns with their values. And I think that actually is a good way to think about e-commerce in particular. And this is a bigger discussion, but it's good to, I was talking to Margaret Bloomstein about this yesterday. It is good to be very clear about not just your, brand in terms of, okay, we sell coats. But in terms of your brand, in terms of your values. I think that for a long time we've said, here's the business discussion, here's the ethics discussion, and never the twain shall meet. Or you have to balance the two somehow. And I'm like, if your business model has to somehow get on a scale with ethics, right? Because it's somehow not inherently ethical, okay, we've already got a problem. Those should be the same conversation. We shouldn't be, So I feel like that is and that's a long-winded way of saying that I wouldn't want to use confirmation bias to encourage the buyer flow. I would want to use actually the opposite to reinforce the buyer flow, so that by the time the person actually makes the decision, they are sure because they've really tested all the alternative theories. And that, I think, makes a more loyal customer, which in the long run is way more valuable to you than someone you kind of sort of duped into clicking too fast.
And I'm sure for Patagonia, it also works in favor of the number of returns, which is, in retail, that's a killer hit to the bottom line, right? So returns is a thing that people don't talk to you about in retail, especially online. So I think, that's actually smart business in addition to being sort of sustainable from a planetary perspective. And I know I'm a big fan of them. So, but yeah, I think that's definitely, it makes good business sense. And I think, to your point, I think it's amazing that people don't bring ethics and transaction all onto the same sort of point. It could make very good business sense, like this case does, and we need to probably start looking at that stuff more closely, given the pandemic that we're all going through, right? So, yeah, amazing. I think we got.
Talk to us a little bit, Dave, about choice architecture and why we should care about it.
Oh, absolutely. So choice architecture is a concept that I believe Thaler came up with in his book Nudge with Cass Sunstein. And it's basically this idea that we architect, the way that a particular environment is architected, the way it's created, the way it's designed, influences decision making. All right, so they talk about this debate over school lunches and cafeterias, and where do you put the healthy food and where you put the not healthy food, and you can structure literally where you put the food in a cafeteria based on any number of factors. You can do it from, most expensive to least expensive, healthiest to least healthiest. There's any number of ways to, and yeah, it turns out if you sort of make the healthier food easier to reach, essentially, more prominent, it tends to move better, right? And we've actually known this in retail for a long time. You've got something you want to sell, there's certain places you can put it in the store that make it, those end caps, baby, they'll move faster, right?
Right.
So, and the question is, do you do that? Like, it's the why behind that design. It's like, do you put the stuff on the end cap that is, that you're trying to move because it's getting old product? Do you move the stuff to the end cap that has a higher profit margin, right? Or do you move the stuff to the end cap that's actually healthier and better for people, right? Whatever choice you make, that architecture is going to influence the behavior of your customer. So that's the idea behind choice architecture. And it's kind of the core idea of the book, is that your design decisions will in fact influence people's behavior, probably in ways they don't even realize. And I bring this up a lot because people sort of ask, well, why even, like, it's too dangerous. You're manipulating people by using any of these techniques. Like, so let's just have neutral design. And it's like, that's not a thing. I could randomly assemble, right? Even the objects behind me. Like, I didn't actually arrange any of that. My wife did, right? And I don't know that she had any particular agenda in mind, but if you look at that, your mind will start to tell a story about those objects. And if I change the order of the objects, again, even randomly, your mind will tell a different story about that, because we are pattern making machines. It's just how we live. We can't help ourselves. So you can't actually introduce a design that isn't going to influence behavior. So at least try to make it moral, because you don't have, neutral just isn't an option.
Yeah, and so does actually neutrality exist? It doesn't, right? I mean, theoretically speaking, we all have our cognitive biases, right? So we just, I mean, it's one of those things. It's something that we have to mitigate against using some of the techniques that you discussed. What has been sort of has the problems that are going on, or the stuff that we're seeing on in the U.S. in terms of Black Lives Matter and this refocus on systemic bias, racial bias in this case, has that have impact on the book? I mean, in terms of has there been a positive impact, I guess, and people saying, hey, look, I need to start paying attention, and we need to read what Dave's got to say?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly frank, as this year has borne out, the book came out in August, late August, mm-hmm. and we could see the writing on the wall. We tried they basically got the engine moving a little faster to get it out a little sooner, because it was clearly relevant, more relevant than we expected it to.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, we've been talking about this stuff, forever. I give a talk related to this book called Design for Having Bodies, and the first time I gave it was in 2017 at UX Copenhagen. And even from the very first time I gave it, there was a Black Lives Matter slide in there. And it was in there because I was making a point about a bias called déformation professionnelle, which is basically the bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job. And I told a story about how Chief Ramsey of the Philadelphia Police Department, maybe 10 years ago, asked every one of his police officers, what do you think your job is? And they would say something like, to enforce the law. And he would say, okay, well, what if I told you your job is to protect civil rights, right? That's a much bigger job than enforcing the law. It encompasses that, but you also have to treat people with dignity. And I brought that story then, and there was literally a Black Lives Matter slide up, right? I brought that story then to make the point that, how you define your job is a matter of life and death. And I kind of extend that to us as designers. Like, our jobs are harder than we think too, right? And we can't define them in a way that's simply design cool stuff. We need to define them in a way that lets us be more human to each other, right? The same way that cops need to define their job in a way that lets them be more human to us. And obviously, like, I'm still giving that talk, and that slide is still under, and that paragraph is still in the book. Like, I talk about this in the book too. And I get so much more emotional now, obviously. Like, this is so much more in our face now and obvious. It's always been going on, but it's even more, piercing now.
Right.
But I left it in there because it's even more true now, or it's even more obvious now how important that is. So yeah, this is all extremely relevant, and I do think that it's, hopefully it's giving people something to think about and a way to contextualize the Black Lives Matter movements to beyond, okay, this isn't just about defunding the police, it's about rethinking how we treat each other at the interpersonal level and at the systemic level too, right? Because that's the other big conversation that's happening now. Yes. In a way that's not really so much 10 years ago of, oh, it isn't just a few bad eggs. We need to rethink the entire police department. We need to rethink the electoral college. We need to rethink how the entire, criminal justice system works. Like, all of these conversations are happening now, talking about the system as opposed to talking about this one law or this one policy.
And I think, the thing that we started with, I mean, it's still, giving me some sort of palpitation or pause, the concept of system, right? So most of our systems are going the way of AI. I mean, whether we like it or not, it's happening, right? And even in the middle of this pandemic, even the drug research that we're doing, I mean, there's a lot of AI being used across the board, right? I mean, because we wanted it to do it faster, better, quicker. And so we're unleashing a lot of sort of systems on them, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So some of this pattern stuff gets done. So if the testing was done mostly on white males and not on Indians and Chinese, right, you're going to have that bias, from a genetic perspective. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff also now inbuilt into these, development of vaccines, of drugs, and we've sort of unleashed it. So the systems problem is, compounded by the fact that the systems themselves have gotten a lot sort of predictive or faster in some sense, and therefore these biases are getting accentuated quite rapidly. So I think the book is really timely because it does sort of give us people who are in the tech area, who are in even in marketing, to sort of step back and say, hey, we really need to sort of maybe slow down or look at these things that we design, be it a FMCG product or a computer system or a marketing campaign or content, to sort of, are we sort of doing this with these principles in mind? That are we actually understanding that there could be cognitive bias in there? I think that's really what I'm hearing today.
Yeah, and it has to be in the budget, right? Because I think a lot of what's motivating the rush, right, is capitalist forces, where it's like, I get that, but we're going to make more profit faster if I don't stop and do an assumption audit, right? Or the default is white males, and that's kind of who I'm marketing to. So what if we just did that, right? Or basically, there's not as much. I'm making a moral argument, and even honestly a business argument, for slowing your customers down. But again, the bias is toward, well, it's worked for us so far going really fast. Let's just keep going fast, right? Like, I'm not seeing it hit to my bottom line, so maybe we just keep going fast, right? And I think that's why I say when I give these talks, or I'm like talking about the book, I say my goal is to change hearts and minds and budgets, because in the world I live in, if it isn't in the budget, it's not actually happening. It doesn't really exist, right? And so I usually encourage people to start small with something like that assumption audit, because it's maybe a 1-2 hour meeting. And so I can go to my boss and say, hey, can I just get 2 hours on the budget, right? It's a 60-day project. I just need 2 hours out of the whole 60 days to make it a little less likely we're going to make something harmful happen, right? And if that works, maybe on the next project I can be like, hey, remember how well that assumption audit went? Okay, this time I want 1 day for a red team to come in. Just 1 day. That's all I need. I know it's more, but it's not that much. It's a 90-day project. Give me 1 day. You still have 89 days to do it any way you want. Give me that 1 day, right? And so you grow that, right? Almost like a virus inside the company to the point where all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, of course you can have 2 weeks, but we're an inclusive design company now. Go for it.
We have questions.
Yeah, actually, we have Frank Spillers joining us. He says, love the message, design with and for customer values. Incidentally, we're actually talking to Frank next week, so it's great that he joined us. And we have Ritu asking another question. If we all have cognitive bias and technology is not neutral, what's the good news?
Oh, well, the good news is we have had methods for making better decisions for literally thousands of years. The study of ethics, which is really just the study of how do you ask questions around really thorny, fuzzy, non-hard science, right, issues has been with us for literally thousands of years. We've just never paid them very well. So when we say, okay, now we need to set up a method. So red team, blue team, for example, like that isn't something I made up like 2 weeks ago. That's been with us ever since we've had the military and journalists. They've been using it for years. Cybersecurity has been using it for a very long time. The idea of quality assurance, right? So QA has been with us in tech for a very long time, right? And no one would dream of launching a website without having to go through QA first, right? Are you crazy? All I'm talking about is basically an ethical QA, right? And sort of saying, okay, the decisions you made to arrive at this design, I want to quality check that approach. Like, does that actually make sense? Daniel Kahneman wrote a great article for the Harvard Business Review years ago where he sort of took the ideas from Thinking Fast and Slow, which is foundational work here. You've got to read it. And a huge influence on my book. And he kind of applied them to the decision-making process at an organization, which is super biased. And sort of saying you got to apply those same principles to sort of slow down that thinking. So the ideas I'm talking about aren't new at all in terms of how to approach this stuff. It's just a question of, are you willing to put it in your budget, right? Are you willing to accommodate? And we did the same thing with accessibility. We started out with, what are you talking about? Not everybody can see all colors all the time. But that's a thing. But do I care? Why do I care? Why should I care about this? I'm trying to ship something, right? 2, oh yeah, it's the law. And my company, for one, like our statement of work when we do work for you, like says AA and no lower. Like we will have people sort of try to like send us RFPs that are like, oh, we only need AAA compliance or something like that, or like lower compliance. And we're like, I mean, that's nice, but we're not going to do anything less compliant than AA. Sorry, right? So that's how far we've come, right? And it took 20 years or so, right? I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight, but the sooner it happens, the better.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just have a follow-up question. Obviously, this pandemic has affected how we as human beings interact socially. Do you think it is having a long-term effect on user experiences?
Oh my God, yes. And I kind of begin to guess what that will be. Like it is in the nature. The one thing that seemed certain toward the beginning of this. And it's funny, my wife's a pediatric neuropsychologist, so she's much more attuned with how health really works. And back in March, she was like, Dave, sit down. This is going to be at least 18 months. And this is back in March when everyone was like, okay, we'll be fine by the summer, right? maybe if at the latest, right? And she was like, Dave, 18 months. And I'm like, oh. And she's, at this point, 18 months is sounding like a best case scenario.
Right. Exactly.
So thinking about that at that scale, when I realized I'm living through something at that scale, I thought back to 1918, I thought back to the bubonic plague, I thought back to basically this idea that there was no world-changing event, right? Nothing that affects this much of the globe at the same time in a similar way that doesn't fundamentally change something about the world, right? You get the Industrial Revolution related in some ways to the bubonic plague. You get there's very little. You have a whole bunch of changes coming out of the Spanish flu. Like just fundamental shifts happen when stuff like this. And it was sort of like one of those. I know something fundamental is going to change coming out of this. What that is, I'm not sure, but it's going to be something. You're not going to go back to normal. And what's interesting about that moment is you see now people trying to at least gain that because there's a lot of people for whom normal wasn't working. So it's one of those like, okay, maybe with this much uncertainty, maybe it's possible to get that systemic change, right? Like, because systemic change is hard. Like, it's rare and it's hard. So, but it's most likely to happen when there are chaotic world-changing events. So I honestly, so yes, I absolutely think it's going to change UX. I have absolutely no idea how, right? It's just too chaotic to even, for me personally, to even begin to guess.
Yeah, but change is coming. I mean,
and I'm not just saying good change, right? Like, and I think that's why, like, everyone is trying to do. I mean, I'll be honest. Like, to me, I feel a duty to do something, especially here, and especially now, to introduce something good into the world. And I honestly hope that's what the book does. Like, I thought about, like, again, I was talking to Margot Bloomsday about this. She writes about, like, what can you do, what is the thing that uniquely you can do right now? There's a lot of like table stakes, like getting out the vote and all that stuff. But what can you personally do? What is your gift that you can bring to this moment? And for me, that's what I hope this book is. It's like my way of trying to say, okay, I'm really good at giving talks. I'm really good at writing. I've almost by accident studied the hell out of cognitive bias, and I've got this background in UX. Okay, let's try this.
Well, Karthik, any more questions? Because we're sort of at the time.
Only one thing. Frank Spiller said he's buying your book now.
Oh, that's really so Dave, I mean, it's been. I mean, I've had lots of people prior to this when we first let people know that you're coming on the show. There's lots of interest by people who I normally didn't think would be interested in the subject, right? So everybody's like, whoa. And maybe it's a function of the pandemic, right? And people say, are more aware of this concept. I mean, there's, concept of fake news, people sort of believing things that are hard to believe. There's, clear evidence of certain things, but people still, disbelieve. There are, clearly systemic problems that are sort of kind of coming apart, and the light's being shone on them globally across different countries. And I think it's sort of exposed this whole, concept of, that we have biases and they've been systemic, and those biases are actually significantly hurting some of us greater than others. And that could be insidious enough that could be in everything we do. And it's clearly the premise of your book. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time to sort of dwell into more depth, but I know Karthika has read a few chapters of the book. I'm going to purchase mine in addition to sort of the research I've done behind you. It seems like a really good book to have handy and read through. So I encourage our viewers to do the same. Thank you again for sort of taking the time out from your hectic schedule to kind of join us today on Pandemic Punditry.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's been fascinating, and I've come out a bit more educated than I was when I went in. And frankly, Karthik and I started this in April. I think we are close to our 50th episode now. And,
congratulations.
Every twice a week at least, we spend an hour with someone fabulous from across the world. And for those 2 hours at least, we are filled with hope and spirit. And I think in a pandemic time like this, that's the best we can ask for, right? So even if it's only 2 hours a week where we get to interface with amazing people all across the world, and they just help us sort of inject hope into our lives, I think then we've achieved what we meant to achieve by starting this podcast. So thank you very much for gracing our show, and all the very best with your book. And we'll put the links for people to buy it as well. And again, thanks again for joining us, Dave. Have a great weekend and a good upcoming week.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks, Dave. You might want to look up this Twitter bot that came out about 4 years ago called Tay, which Microsoft put out, that really reinforces bias. Within 24 hours, it turned into a racist bot. That was
yeah, it's so crazy. yeah. Awesome.
See you later. Thanks, Dave.
Take care. Thanks again.